Hello friends, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we return to an era when, if you weren't shivering from snowstorms, you were blinking through the smoke of a fire pit inside a cave. The setting is the peak of the Ice Age, around 21,000 to 15,500 years before the Common Era. Temperatures dropped by up to 20 degrees Celsius. Sea levels were 100 meters lower, and humanity was still barely surviving in animal skin tents, trembling but still inspired enough to draw skirted lions on cave walls. This was when humans began to stay put, building bigger tents, gathering firewood more carefully, and apparently developing a taste for aesthetics. At Karane 4, Nahal Hadera, archaeologists found shell beads and ornaments, as if snow wasn't deep enough to stop you from accessorizing. The first prehistoric bread appeared at Shubaika, Jordan. One bite could test the strength of your teeth. The cuisine of the time, dry, bland, occasionally paired with gravel and a firm belief in roots. By the end of the Younger Dryas, the climate warmed up and plants exploded like social media after a reset. Prehistoric humans didn't just hunt, they began to stockpile. Jerf El Amar had communal grain storage, shared grinding stones, and very possibly the first person in history to get annoyed about waiting in line to grind barley. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Right now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a gentle humming sound, and let's step together into tonight's journey. This is the year 2025. The global population has surpassed 8 billion. That's over 8 billion worries, 8 billion smartphones, and still no consensus on whether pineapple belongs on pizza. That number could double by the end of this century. Humanity has now spread across almost every continent, mapped nearly every corner of the world, and even taken its first steps off the planet. More than half of us now live in cities or city-like environments, structured by complex social hierarchies and sustained by agriculture and sprawling bureaucracies. But in the grand timeline of history, these complex societies are brand new. At the height of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, the global population may have been as low as 2 million people, less than 0.1% of what it is today. Human society then was made up of scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, living a lifestyle largely unchanged since the rise of anatomically modern humans some 30,000 years ago. No Google Maps, no houses, no wheat, no bread, no civilization. At least, not the way you and I define it. This was the last glacial maximum, when much of Northern Europe, North America, and Central Asia lay silent under ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick. Temperatures could be up to 20 degrees Celsius colder than today. Land was arid. Forests shrank and huddled around the equator like frozen broccoli. Doggerland, the land bridge between Britain and mainland Europe, was still dry. Places that are deserts today were cold steppes, where small human figures walked along icy shores, holding flint spears and scanning antelope tracks in the snow. And yet, in these frozen lands, humans roamed on, small groups scattered across Europe, Asia, and Africa. They hunted, they foraged, they waited for the seasons to shift, and if they were lucky, they had a hide-covered shelter to brace against winds that cut to the bone. They weren't primitive poor. They were masters of adaptation. In their hands, flint became knives, animal bones became sewing needles. They had tools, wove crude fabrics, and painted lions on cave walls in red ochre, as if to say to the future, I was here. No one had food storage, only food if it didn't outrun you. But sometimes they did gather wild roots, pick millet, or chew berries, what archaeologists would later call proto-agriculture. No one had houses, only temporary shelter, a kind of prehistoric Airbnb without heating. Some huts made of willow branches, mud, and animal bones were built along lake shores, like at Ohalo II in Galilee, Israel, where 6 oval huts from around 20,000 years before the Common Era were found, complete with grass beds and even trash piles. And then, at Ohalo II, they did something never done before. They built dwellings, they made fire pits, and they began grinding wild seeds to eat. No rice paddies, no farmers, but clear signs they were beginning to shift. The Ohalo II settlement was radiocarbon dated to around 20,000 years before the Common Era. Round huts, flat earthen floors, covered with willow branches and oak. Between them were fire pits and hundreds of thousands of charred seed fragments. Wild millet, wild barley, wild legumes. People had chewed, baked, and lived there for years. Also found were hand grinders, primitive sickles, all part of a pre-agriculture setup. The world was still cold, very cold. But in one small lakeside shelter, someone thought, what if we planted a few more seeds nearby? And just like that, civilization began. Not with war, but with millet porridge. As the cold eased and snow turned to rivers, tiny seeds underground began doing what humans had always hoped. They sprouted. Between 14,000 and 12,000 years before the Common Era, the climate gradually warmed. With fewer daily battles against predators, humans finally had time to grind. And they did. Wild millet, barley, legumes, on round stone slabs called quernstones. At a site called Shabaika I in northeastern Jordan, researchers found traces of primitive flatbread, made from wild grains and crushed roots, dating back to around 14,400 years before the Common Era, even earlier than the emergence of agriculture. This might have been the first bread humans ever baked. No yeast, no fluff, and definitely not gluten-free. But it showed that humans didn't just want to eat. They wanted to eat better than yesterday. No one recorded the moment someone first touched a grinding stone. But maybe it happened on a chilly morning, when a child played with seeds near the fire, and an elder noticed, if we crush these, they're easier to chew. And so, the first porridge was born, flavorless, saltless, topping-free, but it marked the beginning of cooking, and likely the first to kneel down and grind those seeds was a woman. In most ancient foraging groups, women were the primary gatherers, and perhaps the first to realize that grinding saved teeth better than raw chewing. Hands coated in earth, shoulders sore from pounding grain. They may have laid the true foundation of nurturing. The riverside village that sighed together. At a site called Nahal Hadera 5, in modern-day Israel, remains of a year-round community were found, with fixed grinding stones, ash pits, and even dog bones. Yes, the first dogs were domesticated around this time, not to guard homes, but probably to lick the burnt bottom of porridge pots. The site also revealed shared tools, possibly the first model of a prehistoric canteen, a shared grinder, a shared oven. Everyone was hungry, so everyone came. Though there were no laws, no chore charts, there was an unspoken rule. If there's a shared pot of porridge, there must be a portion saved for the one who comes late. Thus began the early notion of food distribution, not through decree, but through habit born from survival together. Hands like stone and stomachs needing softness. Grinding seeds wasn't just survival, it was a lifestyle shift. Instead of depending on lucky hunts, humans learned to store. Tiny pits appeared next to tents, filled with dried hulled seeds. Eating seeds instead of meat made populations more stable. Women could have children closer together. Elders lived longer. Children didn't need to learn archery, just how to grind. Instead of chasing prey, they gathered around the fire. The fire produced smoke. The smoke kept away mosquitoes and drew people close. And maybe, for the first time, someone thought, why go anywhere when there's porridge here, a fire, and someone waiting for me to come home? From a stone slab and a single seed, humans shifted from hunters to sitters, from blood-stained fingers to flour-covered hands. No one called them farmers. There were no fields, no hoes, but there was porridge. And that's how real civilization began, by cracking a wild grain, cooking it, and sharing it with whoever was beside you. Somewhere around 11,000 years before the Common Era, something strange happened. Humans began to stay. Not just for a season, not just through the winter, but permanently. Or at least long enough to plant a few rows of beans, raise a few sheep, and leave a few layers of mud under their heels. In the Fertile Crescent, especially in Abu Huraira, along the Euphrates River, in what is now Syria, people stopped. This archaeological site is unique because it contains two distinct layers of habitation. The earliest, around 13,000 years before the Common Era, belongs to a hunter-gatherer community, while the later one, around 9,000 years before the Common Era, shows clear evidence of agricultural settlement. You could say Abu Huraira witnessed the transformation from the ones who go to the ones who stay. And then they began to build homes, not palaces. Just small rooms made of mud, with flat roofs and low doors, enough to block the wind, enough to have a fire inside, and enough to call ours. The first village, where bags became the center of history, Abu Huraira, is where archaeologists discovered wrist bone degeneration, and also spine, knee, and ankle joint wear, not from war, but from grinding seeds too much. That's right. The women here, based on bone evidence, squatted for hours every day, grinding seeds on flat stone tools. They weren't farmers. They were the ones who kept the fire, the porridge, and the stability. No one carved their names into walls, but their worn-out knees, ground down by the rhythm of grinding, laid the first foundation stones of the first village. Each repeated movement left a trace on their bodies, the history of settlement itself. Ironically, when humans began to stay, they also began to hurt. And then came pens, storage pits, and burnt pots. When people no longer had to pack their lives into a leather bag, they began to collect better stone tools, better seeds, and puppies. They began to dig holes to store grain, built low walls to pen in sheep. Their plots now had storage, butchering zones, waste areas, even drying yards for seeds. No one invented zoning maps, but space was clearly divided, not by writing, but by repeated habit. And for the first time, a family might have surplus food. Not much, but just enough to make the neighbors jealous. from porridge pot to village. At Abu Huraira, over 300 residents lived together. No kings, no laws, but they had a sowing calendar. But when people stayed too long, what they began to feel wasn't just a full stomach, but worry. What about the next harvest? Who guards the grain store? Who watches the night when the rain comes? Society, though lawless, began forming unspoken rules. They knew when floods came. They knew where to dry grain. And possibly, they also knew who was sneaking snacks at night. And so, settlement was born, not from ideals, but because knees hurt too much to keep walking. But when you sit long enough by the fire, when there's storage, neighbors, and a village, people begin to look up and ask, who are we? Why are we here? That question, unanswered, became the seed of what would come next. The first temples. Imagine sitting in the Mesopotamian plain on a damp morning in 9,200 years before the Common Era. In front of you is a flat rock, a few wild grains still in their husks, some mashed up root, and a blackened lump of charcoal, which is the bread you just tried to bake. No yeast, no salt, no joy. Welcome to the age of burnt bread. The first meal of civilization, thick porridge and brick-hard loaves. Early settled food wasn't a feast. It was the weary repetition of flour, water, fire, sometimes with bits of fish bone. No spices, no cooking oil. Salt. Well, you'd have to walk for days to reach the seashore. Salt wasn't just for flavor. It preserved, traded, and let you feel alive through taste. In a world without fridges or seasoning, lacking salt was a mild spiritual crisis. People in Abu Huraira, Jerf el Amar, or Netiv Hagdud, now in Israel, left behind crude ovens, mostly fire pits in the ground with ash and burnt bread. It's likely they were communal ovens where everyone failed at baking at least once. Some carbonized bread samples show they mixed wild grain with root vegetables and sometimes legumes. At Shubaika 1, a site in northeastern Jordan, archaeologists uncovered burnt bread dating to around 14,400 years before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest baking evidences in the world. These loaves were likely made by grinding wild grain, mixing with root paste, and placing it on hot stones, simple, blackened, and full of nothing but effort. No yeast, no rising. Just, we have grain. Let's try baking. The food wasn't good, but it helped people feel they were trying. Though burnt, bland and dry, that bread meant more than nutrition. It proved that humans were trying to improve, not just eating raw, not just picking and discarding, but grinding, baking, and sharing. That first loaf, even if it made the whole village grimace, was what held them together. If it were the 21st century, it might have had a paleo, gluten-free, high-fiber label and cost $8 a loaf. But to them, it was simply a clumsy effort, shared evenly. Because eating together, even a bad meal, was better than eating alone. And then, someone missed the salt. Someone missed the sacred. When people stayed long enough, they began to feel a different lack, not just of flavor, but of meaning. When the belly is full, when the burnt bread is still eaten, they began to feel empty inside. Because eating full while no one listens to you, no one explains why floods come, why illness happens, that fullness still feels lacking. They started to search for something they couldn't eat, but could believe in. That's when the first stones were raised, not to live in, not to store grain, but to remember, to believe, to fear, to hope, and maybe to pray that tomorrow's bread doesn't burn again, or more simply, to sit together, not because of hunger, but to understand each other, beneath the shadow of a sacred stone. And that was when, in a place called Göbekli Tepe, humans decided to raise the first temple before they ever picked up a hoe. On the southeastern plateau of Turkey, more than 11,600 years ago, a group of people, without hoes, without fired bricks, decided to erect stone pillars nearly 6 meters tall, arranged in circles, carved with lions, hyenas, and bird-headed deities. That place is called Göbekli Tepe, and to this day, it remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. The T-shaped pillars here stand 5 to 6 meters tall, weighing tens of tons, intricately carved with wild animals like lions, boars, scorpions, and hyenas. Yet curiously, there are no depictions of wheat or sheep. Carbon dating shows that these stone structures were built between 9,600 and 8,200 years before the Common Era, earlier than any known village, earlier even than agriculture itself. And that paradox led archaeologists to exclaim, perhaps faith came before the plough, because they built temples. Before they built homes. Temples came before fields, because beer came before bread. Near Göbekli Tepe, traces of heated malted barley were found, one of the earliest known processes of brewing beer. Not bread, not porridge, but beer. Evidence shows they fermented wild grains, possibly combined with naturally fermented fruit, to create a beverage, not just for intoxication, but for connection. And that may have been the reason they gathered. Ritual, beer, and temples, not hunger. The first beer, not cold, not smooth, but sacred. You'd be disappointed if you imagined golden chilled beer in oak barrels. The first beer resembled frothy gruel, slightly sour, cloudy. But it had yeast. It got you tipsy. And most importantly, it made people linger after eating. In ancient rituals, fermented drinks often accompanied singing, dancing, storytelling, and blurring the lines between human and divine. Göbekli Tepe may have been the first place where people drank beer, to remember their ancestors, a gathering to raise stones, and then bury them again. Göbekli Tepe had no homes, no wells, no cemeteries, but it had hundreds of stone pillars carefully buried after use. People raised them, gathered, performed rituals, and then buried them again. Perhaps they believed sacred things should return to the earth, or perhaps they feared what they themselves had built. From drinking together to collective memory, a place where no one lived, but everyone came. No city, but there were ceremonies. No market, but there was beer. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a center of power, but a center of something unnamed. A place people came not to take, but to leave something behind. Time, effort, and a small part of themselves. And maybe, at 4 p.m. on some ancient day 11,000 years ago, someone lifted a bowl of frothy barley beer, closed their eyes, and thought, I belong to something greater. If Göbekli Tepe was a place to believe in the unseen, then Çatalhöyük, a few hundred kilometers and a few millennia away, was a place to live with it. Around 7,500 years before the Common Era, on a muddy plain in southern Anatolia, one of the first cities emerged. No walls, no streets, just rooftops pressed together like a beehive, and people moved by climbing from roof to roof. No squares, no castles. But inside those packed mud brick homes, people lived, cooked, gave birth, died, and were buried right beneath the floor. Homes in Çatalhöyük had no front doors. People climbed up and down via ladders, like descending into the earth. The house became a nest, a shelter, protecting both the living and the dead. Sleeping with ancestors, literally. At Çatalhöyük, the dead weren't taken to cemeteries. They were placed on their sides, knees drawn up like fetuses, laid in hollows beneath the bedroom or kitchen floor. Sometimes they were buried with bracelets made from shells, fox teeth, or stone blades. And then something stranger happened. Skulls were dug up again. Not for worship, but to be reattached to another body. A kind of assembly, memory or spirit. Archaeologists found evidence of human skulls attached to clay figurines or placed in honored spaces within homes. Some skulls were painted red, others smoothed, as if caressed, carefully preserved. Red ochre, symbolizing blood, vitality, and rebirth, was often sprinkled around the body or painted onto the skulls. Some were even sculpted with facial features, as if to preserve a memory tenderly and specifically. No one knows for sure why. Perhaps it was a way to keep loved ones present after death. Or maybe a ritual for important individuals, where the head became a symbol of power or remembrance. The first city, where everything was too close. Walls were shared, roofs connected. The dead lay beneath the living. There were no public trash sites because waste was dumped out onto the roof. They lived under one roof, but rituals were private. The living were many, but sacred things, like skulls, like death, remained quietly in places only the family knew. No toilets. Everything was tucked into hidden corners and then covered. Çatalhöyük wasn't an ideal place to live, but it was the first place where humans tried dense living. Not a few dozen like Abu Huraira, but up to 8,000 people. And they lived that way for more than 1,000 years. No kings, no soldiers, no law, but with rituals and remembered heads. Placing death next to the stove to make life more meaningful. In Çatalhöyük, death wasn't pushed far away. It lay beneath the stove, beneath the bed, sometimes right in the corner where you put your morning porridge. Maybe that's what made life more sacred, because when the dead are still present, you can't live carelessly. Being close doesn't always mean understanding, but keeping each other's memory, that's the first step to becoming a community that doesn't forget. And when a head was placed back onto a body, even if it wasn't the right one, it was humanity's way of saying, we're not ready to forget each other. If you've ever seen massive stone pillars buried deep in the earth, carved with lions, bison, and bird-headed humans, then it's very likely you've heard something our ancestors wanted to say from 11,000 years ago. At Göbekli Tepe, Karahantepe, Noctory, and dozens of other sites along what is now Şanlıurfa province, Turkey, clusters of carved stones began to appear, not connected to any dwellings, but full of symbolism. The T-shaped pillars, up to 6 meters tall, sometimes featured human arms folded across the stomach, as if embracing something invisible. The bodies were carved, but the faces were left blank, as if the gods were still, considering what they should look like. This gesture, arms folded across the belly, was repeated many times and might have represented humility, prayer, or some silent sacred posture. The face was missing, but the stance looked like a guardian, and they stood guard through 10,000 years of dust until archaeologist Klaus Schmidt excavated them in 1995. They didn't write, but they carved. No letters, but images. At Göbekli Tepe, Each ceremonial area was built in a circular layout, with two central pillars standing tallest, facing each other like lead characters, surrounded by many smaller ones, arranged like spectators. The space in the center may have been used for communal rituals, where someone once stood beneath the highland sky, shivering from both the cold wind and the weight of speaking on behalf of the entire community. Each pillar was an inscription. Snakes slithered, birds flew, hyenas growled, scorpions crawled beneath. These animals weren't decorations, they were messages. We remember you, or we're still afraid. Some stones at Göbekli Tepe bear traces of blood, wine and fire ash, as if they were used in very specific rituals, and instead of writing on paper, they left it in stone, a kind of language that needs no translation, just a glance and a shiver. It could have been collective memory. When they had no script to write about fear, they carved snakes. When they had no poetry to describe dreams, they carved birds. When they had no music for their emotions, they let the stones sing in images, spiritual walls connecting humans with the sky. Some stone circles had a clear center, like a stage. Perhaps someone once stood in the middle, under the stars, speaking to the crowd or to the gods. These carvings weren't decorations, they were cosmologies. Sky above, earth below, snakes at the edge, and humans right in the middle. This may have been the birthplace of mythology, where stories were told in stone, where people cried, sang, looked up and trembled. Faceless statues, and the question, who are the gods? Some figures had human heads but no faces. Some pillars had hands but no chest. Between man and beast, no clear line. Were they carving themselves as part of nature? Or were they carving gods whose names they dared not speak? At Karahan Tepe, full-body statues were found, but they faced the wall as if in shame or hiding something. Even their stone gazes still make us turn away. Stone whispers, left in the desert. No one alive can say what happened among those pillars, but it's the silence that speaks the loudest. Because when no one tells the story, each person who comes after must imagine it. And maybe that was the whole point. Because belief doesn't lie in answers. It lies in the chill you feel as you step through the shadow of a stone that has stood watch for 11,000 years. And when those stones stop whispering, humans return to places with roofs, with stoves, with the dead lying beneath the floor, to hear another kind of voice, the scent of homeland, rising from beneath the ground. This was the strangest phase in human history, when humans, once the undefeated predators, decided to stay home and grow beans. From around 9,000 to 7,000 years before the Common Era, in the Fertile Crescent, especially in the Zagros Mountains, Iran, and eastern Turkey, wild animals began to disappear from the fire pit. In their place, bones of sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, the first for domesticated animals. Not just for meat. Goat hair was woven into fabric, cow milk was drunk, and pig bones were sometimes carved into tools. This was no longer hunting, this was herding. And once humans stopped chasing prey, they began timing dinner. Across central Anatolia, wild animal bones at archaeological sites decreased dramatically. In their place, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, already domesticated. No more war horses, just slow herds of sheep. No more spears, just low fences. And so, the hunter vanished from the epic. Hands once holding spears now held rakes. Hunting demanded strength, But farming required patience, and from here a new outcome emerged: division of labor. Men could till the land, build pens. Women continued selecting seeds, cooking, drying grain. Children herded sheep, chased birds, and played in the dirt. A new world opened, where everyone had a specific role. Back then, there was only one job: run faster than the deer. Now there were jobs like seed smasher, granary keeper, and morning chicken counter. At Sayonu in Turkey and Jericho in Palestine, evidence of systematically planted seeds, barley and wheat fields, and stone tools specialized for cutting crops was found. Instead of crouching behind bushes, humans were now up at dawn, checking fields, gathering straw, threshing grain. They no longer needed to outrun gazelles. They just had to get ahead of the caterpillars. And the strange part, they didn't miss the old days. No legends of the last warrior, only traditions of the best-looking grain, the ancestors of seasonal anxiety. Agriculture didn't just make porridge, it made anxiety. Waking up each morning, early humans no longer asked, "Where do we hunt today?" but, "Did the rain flood the granary last night?" The rise of grain storage, farming tools, and irrigation channels meant life depended on the seasons, and for the first time, humans learned to endure helplessness. You can sow all you want, but if the rain doesn't come, you'll be left staring at burnt bread together. No more hunting, so people started counting chickens. When there's a granary, someone must guard it. When there's a guard, rules appear. When there are rules, someone breaks them. And so, power emerged. No one meant to be a leader, but someone held the granary key, and suddenly, all eyes in the village were on them. No one meant to be a lawyer, but someone argued better, and everyone began listening. From land division to disputes, from grain storage to property marking, the first seeds of inequality and power sprouted right beside the young barley shoots. Settling down led to population growth. Children no longer grew up on the road, but beside the fields. And when the number of people exceeded the number of timely rains, conflicts began. Land had to be divided. Grain had to be measured. Someone had to know who planted and who didn't. The concept of property was born, not out of greed, but because rats didn't know how to share. And when someone was accused of stealing from the granary, you couldn't throw a spear. You had to argue. And so words began to matter. Rules started forming. The grain heap arguments may have been the very origin of politics. And so, when the last person hung up their spear in the attic and forgot to take it down, history turned a new page. No more deer hunting tribes, but rice and bean villages. No more heroic sagas, but planting schedules. From here, humans no longer moved to survive, but lived to stay in one place. And from there, every tragedy began. Crop failure, burned granaries, and even the human heart began to mold from worry. No one knows exactly when it happened. Maybe one early morning, with dew still on the ground, someone woke up and realized the sheep was still there. It didn't leave. It didn't run. It just stood there chewing grass like the whole world was its home. That was a strange moment, because for tens of thousands of years before that, every animal had been a chase. Humans never thought the day would come when the prey would choose to stay. From tailing to companion, domestication came not from force, but from salt and patience. Around 8,500 to 7,500 years before the Common Era, Archaeological evidence from the Zagros region in Iran and Anatolia shows sheep and goats began to be raised systematically, no longer just hunted for meat, but selected, fed, led, brought back. Healed fractures, altered gender ratios, and even sheep droppings in the soil all prove fixed animal husbandry. No one domesticated with brute force. They used salt, sprinkled here and there patches of grass left untouched, to earn trust. And so, the first sheep didn't run away. Life lost its thrill, but brought milk and warm wool. Sheep offered not just meat, but milk, manure and wool for weaving. From rough animal hides, humans for the first time spun woolen fabric, something that fought the cold and sparked the first flair for style. At Çatalhöyük, tools for spinning and coarse cloth have been found, and traces of the first aesthetic transformation, from covering up to dressing up. With wool, dye from red ochre, and a bit of flair, tribes began to have style. And so fashion began, with the first model being humans themselves. The first pen, and the idea of waking up to find your livestock still there. No barbed wire, no chains, but they managed to build pens from earth, stones, and routine. The first pen was just an open space with someone watching. Then came walls, straw roofing, divided zones, one for sheep, one for grain. And if in the morning you opened your eyes and saw the flock still there, that was a huge victory. It meant trust had lasted through the night. Herding and teaching each other how to herd. Trust. Humans learned how to herd, taught children to call sheep, throw stones in patterns, sing morning songs to keep the flock in line. More importantly, they learned how to guide each other. While herding together, they shared stories. While building pens, they created unspoken rules. Who watches at night, who patches the roof, who boils the water. And from that, perhaps, the first livestock didn't just feed stomachs, but nurtured the concept of community. When the first sheep didn't leave, humans didn't either. They stayed, they cared, they taught each other patience, not with nature, but with themselves. No longer lone warriors in the forest. Now they were shepherds and firekeepers for the community. And so, for the first time in history, a living creature chose to stay, not out of fear, but because someone was waiting. Not because it was chained, but because it felt this place could be home. Once there were granaries, pens, and sheep that didn't run, people began thinking about walls, not to block wild beasts, but to block each other. In Jericho, around 6,800 years before the Common Era, they built a stone wall nearly 4 meters high, surrounding a small settlement. No one knows what they were defending against. Maybe floods, maybe humans. Because once they learned to store grain, they realized grain could be stolen. The first tent wasn't just for shelter, but for separation. In places like Ain Ghazal, in Jordan or Beida, people lived in round huts made of clay, thatched with dry grass. Simple, with no fences. But soon, houses with thicker walls appeared, raised floors and smaller rooms. One for people, one for grain, one to sit alone. That was when privacy was born. For the first time in history, humans had a place no one else was allowed into. Walls block sound, and the things left unsaid. Walls keep noise out, and feelings too. People once lived together in caves, around a fire. Everything shared, meat, stories, sighs. But with walls, sadness found a private corner. With granaries came secrets. With rooms came arguments. With closed doors came questions no one dared to ask. And strangely, progress didn't bring people closer. The first border wasn't on a map, but between two villages. No war needed, just 2 yards next to each other. When 1 yard grew more food, when one pen was cleaner, comparisons began. Then envy, then complaints, then silence. And so, even if separated by just a mud wall, 2 villages stopped being a community. From shared round tents to houses with doors, emotions changed, no longer hearing each other's breath at night. No longer seeing tears when crops failed. Still in the same village, same season, same sheep, but now growing apart in every detail. And maybe the thing no one said is that we traded connection for progress. We built walls to block wind, block beasts, block enemies. But sometimes we blocked out ourselves. What it was like to be Egyptian royalty. There is no rooster crowing, no clock, no gentle sunlight slipping through curtains like in fairy tales. In the royal palace of Egypt, you don't wake up on your own. You are awakened by the scent of ambergris rising from a small bronze bowl and the whispers of a servant bowing by your bed. The sun god has risen, Your Majesty. The pharaoh is the living embodiment of Ra, and like any god, he doesn't have the privilege of sleeping in. The moment you open your eyes, still half asleep, crust in your eyes, mouth yet to swallow its first drop of saliva, there are already at least 6 people present, 1 to wipe your forehead, 1 holding a vessel of cleansing water, 1 waiting with your morning attire, and 1 just standing there, nodding slowly to confirm that you have survived the night. The pharaoh's bed, made of cedar wood imported from Lebanon, layered with linen soft as clouds, is no longer a place of rest. The room where you sleep isn't large, but it is sacred. The stone walls are carved with images of Ra lifting the sun, and the ceiling painted deep blue like a night sky, dotted with golden stars. By the door, a temple cat of Bastet lies still, blinking lazily. The oil lamps haven't fully gone out, their dim light sparkling across golden dust in the air. Dust scattered to retain moisture and ward off evil spirits, according to court priest beliefs. The space is both tranquil and tense, as if the statues themselves are observing your every breath. It is a stage, and every morning a silent performance begins again. No one asks, "Did you sleep well?" Because fatigue, if it exists, is not allowed on the face of a god. Even if you woke up with a pounding headache from wearing a multi-kilogram wig all day yesterday, right after you open your eyes, your body is gently lifted, according to ritual. A servant carefully places a few drops of holy river water in your hands, using a warm linen cloth to wipe around your eyes, neck, and chest, as if tending to a living statue. Another pours fragrant oil from a small alabaster jar, rubs it into their palms, and gently presses it to your temples in slow circles. Nearby, a priest chants the morning prayer, reading from a wooden card carved with a divine calendar. No one speaks. No one dares to make an extra sound. This silence isn't peace. It's the tension of an ancient rite. One servant supports your left arm. Another steadies your back. They never let you sit up on your own. These attendants, mostly eunuchs or high-ranking servants chosen from noble families, have been trained from childhood not just to serve, but to know how to disappear. Each has a specific task, 1 to wipe your brow, 1 to measure room temperature, 1 to support your knees, and one responsible for recording the exact time of your awakening to log in the royal diary. An organization running smoothly, without a word, but full of watchful eyes, not out of love, but because it is the law. The living God must not bend like a commoner. Outside the door, the guards have already changed shift before dawn. The courtyard has been wiped with lotus-scented cloths. The flower vases, silk curtains, even the air, all arranged for one purpose: to make the Pharaoh's moment of awakening perfect. But what's the truth? The Pharaoh, though a god, can still feel shoulder aches, a stiff back, and a dry throat like anyone else living near the desert. There are even mornings where you quietly gaze out the stone window, watching pale light spill across the courtyard, and wonder if the cat stretching out there is freer than you are. In that moment, even a god may long to be a creature that no one wakes, with no dozens of people waiting for a signal, and no need to wear a wig heavier than your own head. And in the hazy dawn light, amid all the eyes awaiting command, you might just want to say one very human thing: "Can I sleep 10 more minutes?" But you don't say it, because gods don't get sleepy, and Egyptian royalty waits for no one. After having his face wiped, his body oiled, and staring long enough into the loneliness of his own existence, the Pharaoh proceeds to the next stage of the morning ritual, assuming the appearance of a god. Not to walk a red carpet, but to receive officials, perform rituals, and brace himself for full-time symbolism. First comes the wig, the greatest emblem of power in ancient Egypt. A wig isn't a fashion choice. It is a social rank, a political statement, a diploma worn on the head. Slaves aren't allowed to wear one. Priests wear simple ones. And the Pharaoh, he wears a miniature pyramid made of human hair, animal fur, woven threads, perfumes, and gold thread. The royal wig isn't just large, it's heavy. It is kept separately in a stone box, wrapped in perfume linen, and guarded by someone as if it were a national treasure. Before it is worn, artisans, the royal stylists, check the humidity, soften the inner edges with warm beeswax, and spray it lightly with lotus essence to remove the divine scent left from yesterday. Then comes the false beard. The Pharaoh, whether male or female, must wear a beard during ceremonies. No facial hair, no problem. There are straps. The Pharaoh's false beard is curled at the tip, a shape reserved for the one who stands between humans and gods. That curved form originates from the symbol of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and became the standard for supreme power. Whether male or female, once seated on the throne, you wear the curled beard. Pharaoh Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's rare female rulers, also wore a false beard during important ceremonies, not because she wanted to look like a man, but because no one is allowed to appear before their people with a bare chin, not even if that chin is carved into temple walls as a divine symbol. It's not an accessory. It is a mask of identity imposed by the throne. Not everyone is allowed to wear the curled beard. Only those with no right to refuse the role. Each step of the morning grooming follows strict sequence, as if you are preparing a living altar. One person combs the lower edge of the wig. One wipes sweat stains from the silk collar. One holds up a bronze mirror, tilted at the exact angle so the Pharaoh can look at himself and wonder, the one in the mirror, is that really me? While commoners eat hard bread with watered barley beer, the Pharaoh, at times, eats nothing at all. His breakfast is ritual. Every gesture is observed, recorded, analyzed like prophecy. Because you may skip a meal, but you cannot appear before your people with messy hair. Under the morning light filtered through linen curtains, in a room cleansed with fragrant oils, the pharaoh, now perfumed, hair pressed, ivory belt tightened, is finally deemed worthy to exist in the eyes of the world, no longer a sleepy human, but Ra, stepping out of a dream soaked in fragrance. And everyone will bow, but no one may look for too long, because the divine requires no mortal gaze to be confirmed. You'd think that after being wiped down, perfumed, bearded, and fitted with a wig the weight of a small child, the pharaoh might get a moment to sip something by the lotus pond. No, by 7 in the morning, or earlier if the Nile is flooding, he steps into a meeting. Not an online meeting, no email summaries, no PowerPoint, just people, real, tired, and full of problems. The early meeting often takes place in a cool stone chamber with 4 pillars carved in the image of Horus with outstretched wings, a smooth basalt floor, and a ceiling so high it echoes every word like a divine decree. Morning light filters in through a slit near the ceiling, casting a slanted beam across the floor, where officials bow their heads and golden dust floats like sacred mist. No one speaks. No one dares to cough. Every footstep echoes as if judged by the gods themselves. The tension in the room isn't from heat, but because any word could be carved into stone. And in such a place, even a sneeze could become a political act. The northern fields are ravaged by mice. Villagers plead for help. The temple of Sobek lacks paving stones. A breeding bull was spiritually robbed during the night, suspected involvement from the neighboring village. A complaint that the sacred rooster of East Village crowed at the wrong time, ruining the morning wine offering. A pile of cow dung crossed a border, sparking a land dispute between 2 onion-growing families. A group of pyramid workers went on strike over a shortage of bread. The pharaoh, of course, may not sigh. He is a god, and gods never show irritation. According to the Greek historian Diodorus, every action of the pharaoh, from eating, walking, sleeping, to how time is divided in the day, is predetermined by ancient law. That law specifies the morning meeting time, number of guests allowed, priority order of issues, and even how far a petitioner must stand. Speakers must be 3 steps away from the pharaoh, loud enough, but never harsh. They must not stare too long into his eyes. They must not cough without permission. You might assume the pharaoh is just listening, but in fact, he must make decisions on every issue, right then and there. Each answer might change the fate of an entire region. Ban a harvest, reward a person, exile a family, build another temple, all while maintaining a face as if just stepped out of a divine dream. And if you're wondering, no secretary. There is actually, but not the kind that reminds you of appointments with a buzz. Scribes record. They do not respond. Remembering who submitted what yesterday, or which dispute smells most like rotten fish, that all rests entirely on the pharaoh's memory. And the strange truth is, the more powerful you are, the fewer people dare remind you of anything. Yes, but secretaries back then were scribes, standing on either side, holding wooden boards, charcoal ink, and reed pens. They recorded every ruling in hieroglyphs. 2 scribes stood opposite each other to ensure no discrepancy. One carved directly into soft stone tablets, the other drafted on papyrus, then cross-checked. No one was allowed to comment, only to transcribe. But whenever the pharaoh paused too long, they would exchange glances like witnesses watching. history being delayed by one heartbeat. If the pharaoh misspoke, they would not correct him. They would inscribe the words exactly and archive them in the royal vault. One sentence spoken in the morning could become law for 100 years. No pressure at all. That's why sometimes the pharaoh stays silent for quite a while before answering. Not because he's pondering deeply, but because he's trying to remember what day it is and whether he ate anything this morning. Only after the morning meeting ends is the pharaoh allowed to rise, wash his hands in scented water, change garments, and prepare for the next ritual, the offering at the main temple. And you think going to work early is hard? Try solving a cattle dispute before the sun even reaches the Sphinx's shoulders. After the morning meeting full of petitions and proclamations, the pharaoh steps out of the main hall, not to take a stroll, but to continue the ritual of movement. In ancient Egypt, a pharaoh did not walk like a commoner. His feet must not touch the ground. According to ancient belief, the pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus, son of Osiris, bringer of light and justice to the world. And the divine does not step on the earthly soil, which belongs to the imperfect and the mortal. If a pharaoh accidentally let his heel touch the ground without a cleansing ritual, it wasn't just improper. It was a rupture in the symbolism between heaven and man. Every footstep on soil was a moment of breaking character, a fleeting second of nakedness in the lifelong divine performance. Earth belongs to mankind. The pharaoh, in theory, is a god among mortals, and to let his heel gather earthly dust is a ritual violation. So whenever the pharaoh needs to move, from the temple to the sacred garden, from the concubine's quarters to the offering room, he is transported by an object called a sedan chair. It's a tall wooden seat, carved with dragons and phoenixes, armrests shaped like the god Horus, and two long poles extending out like wings of a bird. The seat is padded with linen, draped in antelope leather dyed purple, a color reserved for royalty. The handles are inlaid with lapis lazuli and carnelian, each stone polished to reflect even the June sun. Beneath the base of the chair, the pharaoh's name and the Eye of Horus symbol are carved, a reminder that, when he sits, the entire world must bow. 4 to 6 strong men lift the chair off the ground, each step they take like carrying the sun itself. The pharaoh does not walk, he floats. But in reality, everyone knows that floating through Egyptian July is an experience with a distinct scent, because even if you don't touch the earth, you still touch sweat. Seated nearly 2 meters above the ground, the pharaoh is cooled by 2 servants waving ostrich feather fans. Each sweep of the fan is a slow, rhythmic breath, as if trying to soothe not just the heat, but the stiffness in his shoulders and neck. Some afternoons, when the sun slaps down from directly overhead, the pharaoh may glance down through the curtain slit and see his shadow drifting across the stone steps, and in that moment, wonder, am I really going anywhere, or just being carried around inside a gilded box? It's called fanning. But in truth, those were elite guards, chosen because they were the only ones trusted enough to stand near the pharaoh's neck, without being suspected of assassination. Which makes sense. At that distance, even one overly enthusiastic flap could become a political plot. And to be fair, the pharaoh isn't the only one suffering. The chair bearers, often muscular soldiers or trained prisoners, must keep their backs straight, shoulders steady, their steps as graceful as a dance. If the chair tilts, it could mean exile. If someone stumbles, usually, no one hears from them again. Midday sun beats down on the stone courtyard like fire. Dust from nearby construction swirls in the air. The royal perfumes mix with the servants' sweat, only to be overpowered by the burning incense meant to repel flies. The pharaoh may not smell it, but everyone walking beneath him certainly does. The journey lasts 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the route and the number of ritual bows required along the way. Every hallway segment holds a statue of a god, and the pharaoh must raise his hand to bless, or pause to let the statue look upon him. Think your morning subway ride is hard? Try commuting on the shoulders of living men. And don't forget, the pharaoh is still wearing a wig, a 3-layer silk robe, and a curled bronze ceremonial beard. You think historical costumes in films look hot. Even with constant fanning, the thick silk and metallic beard can make sweat bead up under the wig. But no one is allowed to see that. The divine appearance must not grimace. Even a single drop of sweat falling to the shoulder could be seen as an ill omen, or worse, proof that he is not truly divine. You've never truly sweated in silence until you know one wrong move might be judged by the gods themselves. Being pharaoh is a full-time job. No vacation, no Sundays, no time off for festivals, and this doesn't stop after you die. In fact, death is merely the next phase in your royal service schedule. It's not an ending, but a transition into your eternal divine version. You think you'll rest in a warm tomb, bathed in golden light, soft music and peace. No, you will be made up, embalmed, and go through 70 days of post-mortem rituals, each with its own schedule. On the 12th day, a troupe of professional mourners performs a grieving ceremony in the southern square, the same space once used for military parades. The women wear linen, sprinkle ash on their heads, and are trained to wail in perfect rhythm and tone. They're not supposed to cry sincerely, just correctly. Behind them, a band plays Farewell to the Sun with harps and stone drums, a piece composed for each pharaoh. The entire mourning ritual is staged like a spiritual performance, where emotions are not spontaneous, but ceremonial, timed, and on pitch. The schedule after death. Day 1, evisceration. The intestines, liver, lungs, and stomach are removed, washed with palm wine packed with resin, and placed into 4 canopic jars, each topped with the head of a protective deity. Day 7, skin purification. The whole body is packed in natron, a dehydrating salt, and lies there for nearly 2 months like a premium dried fish. Day 40, beautification begins. Hair is curled with perfumed oils, the face molded with resin, and the eyes lined with kohl, as if preparing for your final public appearance. And not just any public, but Osiris, Lord of the Dead. To face a god without proper foundation, unforgivable. In Egyptian belief, the way you look when leaving the living world is how you'll appear forever in the next. So best look, divine. Day 70, burial. A long procession enters the valley, led by musicians, priests, hired mourners, and a white bull for sacrifice. And that's just the exterior. Inside the tomb, your eternal workplace. A pharaoh's tomb isn't for rest. It's a sacred post-life office. You're buried with small servant statues, called shabti. These are your outsourced staff in the afterlife, each one engraved with an oath saying, if the pharaoh is called to build a dam, dig canals, or file reports for Osiris, I will go in his place. The more powerful you were in life, the more staff you'll need in death. Each statue carries a gentle curse. If the pharaoh is summoned for labor in the afterlife, the shabti will go instead. So you might think, well, at least they let me rest. No, because if they forget to bury enough shabti, you, even in death, will have to get up and work. Despair yet? Not quite. The living will continue to make offerings for you every day with gifts, prayers, and incident reports. And if they forget, you, an immortal pharaoh, will go hungry in the afterlife. Not for real food, but because no one remembers you enough to send incense through ritual. Eternity, but with conditions. Like a divine subscription plan. If it's not topped up regularly with offerings, it stops working. You, an immortal pharaoh, will go hungry in the afterlife. Eternity, but with conditions. Glory or hard labor. Legend says one pharaoh, exhausted by the demands of the afterlife, was buried with 365 statues, one for each workday. Another pharaoh, who punished the wrong man while alive, was cursed after death. His tomb was raided, his shabti destroyed, forcing him to rise in the villagers' dreams and demand legal restitution. You think pharaohs rest after they die. They just shift from politics to spiritual logistics. You used to think death meant freedom. Pharaoh would tell you, death is just the start of the night shift. And sometimes it's a shift with no raise, no insurance, and entirely dependent on your descendants' memory. Because in the end, the last thing that remains after we leave isn't gold, isn't power, but whether someone remembers to leave a bowl of rice. Pharaoh would tell you, death is just the start of the night shift. If you imagine the ancient Egyptian harem as a place filled with fragrance, velvet cushions and laughter, congratulations. You've fallen into exactly the illusion the pharaohs wanted the world to believe. In reality, the harem wasn't a garden of love. It was a maze of power. A place where every glance, every whisper, even every birth, could determine the fate of an entire dynasty. Who lived in the harem? A pharaoh might have one great royal wife, several noble ladies, a few princesses from political alliances, and dozens, sometimes hundreds, of lower-ranking concubines called those granted favor. They didn't live together, they didn't sing together, and they certainly didn't like each other. They lived scattered across guarded quarters, watched by eunuchs and female overseers, each harboring her own secrets, her own plans, and her own hopes for her child. Because in the harem, giving birth to a prince wasn't a joy. It was a chess move. Politics behind the silk curtains. In a system where the throne wasn't necessarily passed to the eldest son, every prince was a potential. And behind each of those children stood a mother who wasn't willing to wait on fate. A whisper to a priest, a glance at a court advisor, a chance encounter with the pharaoh in the palm garden. Any of these could lead to one prince being promoted early, another child never being mentioned in the royal records. And if you think that's too dramatic, in 1155 BCE, Pharaoh Ramses III was assassinated in a famous conspiracy known as the Harem Conspiracy. The plot was led by a lesser wife named Tie, joined by sorcerers, palace guards, and even close servants. They used spells, codes, and bribes to breach the royal security system. The trial later recorded confessions, a list of conspirators, and the collapse of an entire harem faction. The main culprit, none other than a wife wanting her son on the throne. The result, the pharaoh died. Some were burned alive, Others had their tongues cut out, and the son still didn't become king. Welcome to harem politics. Not a forbidden palace, but a battlefield wrapped in incense and silk robes. The harem was lonely, even with power. The pharaoh's wives were not free to leave their designated zones. They lived under strict rules, surveillance, and a constant fear that a single slip, one poorly phrased sentence, could turn them from mother of a prince into exile from the sacred pool. Some women gained great influence, like Nefertari or Tie, whose images were carved on temples and whose words were inscribed in stone. Tie, mother of Akhenaten, was not only a queen, but a political advisor, one of the rare Egyptian women depicted sitting beside the pharaoh on the throne in carvings. She didn't have to speak. Her presence alone sent a message louder than any royal decree. But no one remembers their names. No one knows who they loved. And no one asks how many times they cried. The silent game. The harem was where women didn't just give birth to children. They gave birth to their own destinies, where power was measured by how long the pharaoh's gaze lingered and how often it returned. And when it was all over, when the pharaoh died, when the sons came of age, when the throne passed to someone new, many of them were buried without names, without tombs, without a single tear shed. Because in ancient Egypt, history was written by men, and the harem was where women tried not to be erased from the final page. You may not see them on monuments. The harem was not a place for love, but a soft battleground where women wore silk robes to play chess with fate. You think they fought for love? No, they fought for the forwarding address of the throne. And every transfer of power, every uprising, began with one very quiet night behind a lotus-embroidered curtain. As Egyptian royalty, you would dine on honey-roasted goose, salt-grilled river fish, fresh figs, wine-soaked dates, and a type of cake called tar, baked from emmer flour mixed with duck fat and dried fruit. Sound luxurious? Yes. Delicious? Possibly. Comfortable? Not exactly. Because the pharaoh's dinner wasn't simply a meal. It was a ritual display of power, immortality, and cosmic order. And you, as the one seated at the center, didn't eat for taste, but for divine duty. While you raised your goblet of wine high, commoners outside the palace were gnawing on emmer bread filled with grit, silently praying they wouldn't break a tooth tonight. Every dish was a prayer. A royal feast didn't begin with bon appetit, but with blessings offered to the god Ra, and dishes passed through plumes of incense. Each plate, before reaching the pharaoh's table, had to be approved by a priest, who murmured incantations, sprinkled scented water, and recited the full name of the dish as if reporting to the divine. Then came the rhythmic chants of the wine attendants. The first cup, for eternal peace. The second cup, so the Nile shall never run dry. The first cup, for eternal peace. The second cup, so the Nile shall never run dry. Grape wine, a luxury only for the elite, was served in stone goblets engraved with the pharaoh's name. If you drank with your right hand, facing east, it signified loyalty. Use the wrong hand or face the wrong way. If lucky, you'd get a gentle reminder. If not, it might end up in the ceremonial report, and nobody wants that. Your seat might be honored or dangerous. Sitting close to the pharaoh, the highest honor, was also the most watched position. Lean too far, use the wrong spoon, or speak without permission. The closer your seat to the throne, the greater the pressure. Even a wince at overly salty fish could be interpreted as divine disapproval, and that might become gossip or scandal. Think the servants just brought food. Wrong. Someone was recording every behavior at the table. And worse, someone was painting the scene onto temple walls. So if you laughed too loudly at a dry pharaoh joke, 3,000 years later, people might still see your mouth open far too wide. Grand food, unhappy guts. The royal diet, heavy on sugar, wine, and low on vegetables, led many pharaohs to obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Studies on mummies show some pharaohs' teeth were ground down from eating bread with sand. Others suffered from gout due to too many animal organs. And many pharaohs had frequent diarrhea from drinking mud-contaminated water. And no one dared ask, "Are you okay? Should we stop at the 6th cup of wine?" Delicious meals, but maintain the mask. Even if your stomach's twisting, you still had to sit straight, nod on cue, and divinely smile, as if your growling belly was the thunder of the god Seth. Dinner wasn't for nourishment, nor was it a private moment. Because even surrounded by hundreds, the pharaoh was the only one forbidden from laughing loudly, speaking freely, or stretching his sore back. He ate under heavy silence, while the eyes of subjects and officials fixed on every chew, as if each bite he swallowed digested a part of the nation's soul. It was to perform the role of God on earth, one who digests not only food, but the universe. You might crave roast meat, but as Pharaoh, you'd receive more than that. You'd get many people watching you chew, and that sometimes was the hardest thing to swallow at dinner. On a beautiful morning in Thebes, the pharaoh decided to go hunting. The horn sounded. The entourage rushed to prepare. The hunting ground had been set up the day before, and the lion was already tied up. Yes, you heard right. In many royal hunts, the chosen animal was already trapped, exhausted, or even restrained so the pharaoh could hit it dead on with an arrow. Because the goal of the hunt wasn't to hunt, it was to demonstrate the king's power over nature, over chaos, and over even deception. The hunter didn't need to be skilled, just divine. Most pharaohs, even those remembered as mighty warriors, didn't need to be real hunters. They needed to appear as masters of everything: the grasslands, the beasts, the wind, and especially the bow. Some carvings in tombs depict Pharaoh striking the lion's heart with a single arrow. No one asked, who tied the lion up? Who positioned it just right for the sunset light to hit? Because no one was allowed to ask. The truth mattered less than the performance. Hunts were propaganda. Every hunt was recorded as a divine feat. The pharaoh subdued the wild beast. Heaven and earth bowed to his will. In reality, the lion may have been caged for 3 days, starved, then released into a wooden ring, where the pharaoh stood 5 meters away, surrounded by musicians, painters, and official scribes. Beside him, the recorder was ready to write into royal chronicles. The arrow of His Majesty, light as the breath of Horus, pierced the beast's heart on the very first shot, even if, in truth, it was the 4th. This wasn't just sport. After hunting animals, the pharaoh might proceed to hunt traitors. Still an entourage, still the horn, still a scribe. The only difference, this time, the targets could speak, and the blood wasn't from wild animals. This was state media, and every arrow carried a message. We still control the jungle, the desert, and the people. The greatest performance, hunting ostriches, Pharaoh. Tutankhamun has a famous mural in his tomb showing him riding a chariot to hunt ostriches. His headpiece adorned with ostrich feathers, the symbol of the goddess Maat, who represents justice and order. Hunting ostriches wasn't about hunger, it was about theology. Catching an ostrich meant capturing the balance of the world, even if, some say, the ostrich was released from a pen and gently herded toward the pharaoh. Not hunting to eat. The hunt wasn't to bring back meat. There was always meat in the royal kitchen. Hunting was a political spiritual ritual where the pharaoh played the divine hero, the one who didn't just rule people, but kept the universe from unraveling. Every animal felled was another moment Ma'at was restored, and chaos was pushed back. So you see, if you went hunting with the pharaoh, you didn't need to bring a weapon. Just bring a scroll to record the victory. And don't forget the rope. Today's lion is a bit strong. The pharaoh is the living embodiment of a god, but his liver is still human. And if you eat too much roast goose, sleep too little, and drink wine instead of water, well, what's coming will come. Illness, the thing every stone statue tries to hide, has entered every glorious palace, every harem chamber, every gilded chariot. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care whether you wear a golden wig or a brown linen scarf. Pharaoh and a medical record as long as the Nile. Most pharaoh mummies, when carefully x-rayed, had issues. Amenhotep III, tooth decay, joint degeneration. Ramses II, arthritis, calcified arteries. At age 90, he must have been a god, always groaning about his knees. Tutankhamun, scoliosis, clubfoot, suspected malaria, and a broken leg bone before death. These were the best cared for people in the ancient world. They had personal physicians with titles like Guardian of the Pharaoh's Chest or Healer of the Navel of the Two Lands. Some royal doctors had their names carved on stelae, buried near pyramids as a reward for healing, or at least for keeping the pharaoh from coughing during a speech. There were priests involved. There were secret treatment rooms in the palace, where the healer held a bronze blade, the priest held incense, and the servant held a jar of scented water. They didn't just treat disease, they negotiated with the gods. One treatment might include setting a leg bone, sprinkling salt, then praying to Ra 3 times. There were oils, ointments, herbs, curses, everything. And still, the body would decay like anyone else's. Even when hailed as the son of Ra, the pharaoh could have a toothache, insomnia, or a persistent cough when the wind changed. It's hard to bless the universe when you haven't slept in 3 nights due to sinusitis. They had medicine, but also superstition. Egyptian medicine was advanced. They could stitch wounds, set bones, identify the heart, liver, and lungs. There were papyri with prescriptions ranging from onions, honey, to dried fish dung. But mixed in were lines like, if the patient coughs to the west, it is due to an evil spirit. If the left eye is blurry, draw the eye of Horus on the patient's forehead. Meaning, the pharaoh would be both wrapped in ointments, blessed with spells, and surrounded by incense. And if the condition didn't improve, they'd call an exorcist. No one was allowed to say, maybe it's the wine. The truth about the royal diet: wine, sweet pastries, animal organs. Everything the commoners didn't have, the pharaoh had too much of. And too much of anything leads to diabetes, gout, artery blockage. Scientists found high cholesterol levels in mummies. Many kings, died from being too rich. The pharaoh could build pyramids, but he couldn't rebuild his arteries. Wait after death. The irony is, after death, the pharaoh's organs were removed. Liver, intestines, lungs, into canopic jars. Brain pulled out through the nose. Heart, sometimes forgotten, like with Tutankhamun. In the end, that disease-ridden body was embalmed, tightly wrapped, beautifully painted, then placed in a gold-plated coffin. It looked like a god, but inside was a skeleton that had once had headaches, diarrhea, back pain, and sometimes deep loneliness. Maybe, after the temple lights faded, after the chants ended, the pharaoh sat alone, cold sweat, heart racing, and didn't understand why he couldn't breathe evenly. What we now call anxiety was once depicted as a king leaning on his staff, resting his forehead in silence for a long, long time. The pharaoh was a king, a god, the axis of the universe, but still a man. And no one, not even him, could cure death with power. When all the feasts have passed, when the temple gates have closed, and the royal entourage has faded into shadow, only a mummy remains, silent, in the stone chamber. The pharaoh stopped breathing 3,000 years ago, but this room, with walls carved in myth, with canopic jars holding the liver, intestines, and a scarab placed where the heart once beat, still whispers. Wind slips through the vaulted cracks, lifting dust into the eyes of statues. Echoes repeat down the corridor, some word, unclear whether it's the king's name, or simply the sound of time breaking apart. The tomb builders were never named. The tomb is a masterpiece, but it doesn't belong to the pharaoh. It was built by laborers who lived a few miles away, in a small village called Deir el-Medina. They lived, loved, carved stone, and wrote on the walls little things, about rain, about their wives, about pay arriving late. They carved the pharaoh as a god, then sat behind the temple and ate dried fish. No one remembers their names, but without them, no one would remember who the pharaoh even was. The reverse journey, from god to dust. Once, the pharaoh's name was etched in gold. To mispronounce it was a punishable offense. To pass a statue without bowing was a disgrace. But time flowed on. The Nile shifted course. The lands turned barren. Temples were buried under sand. And the name once prayed by the whole world now lies misfiled in a museum tag, next to a clay doll. The crack in eternity. Death chooses no one, and forgetfulness chooses just the same. No matter how much wine was poured, how many geese were eaten, how many false beards were brushed each morning, the final truth remains. Every pharaoh returned to stone, and the wind at the end of the corridor is the softest farewell history can whisper. You might think the king was immortal, but in truth, you, the one hearing his story, are the final proof he ever lived. The First Punic War, Rome's first naval battles, from 264 to 256, before the Common Era. 264 BC, Sicily, a morning when no one was sober, but everyone was ready to die. If you look at the Mediterranean map like a refrigerator, then Sicily is the bottom door stuck with magnets. And Messana, the small city in the northeastern corner of the island, is the doorknob being pulled at by two grumpy neighbors at the same time. Rome from the north and Carthage from the south. No one really wanted Messana, but everyone was afraid of the other getting it first. Here's the issue. A group of mercenaries, called the Mamertines, former Campanian soldiers who had once served Syracuse, didn't go home after their contract ended. Instead, they took over Messana. They expelled the original inhabitants and turned the place into a semi-military fortress that operated like a tavern with heavy weapons. The Mamertines had no plan to govern or build. They lived off protection fees from passing merchant ships, controlling strategic sea routes like part-time pirates. Imagine them as a group of Airbnb guests who crowned themselves landlords, then called the cops when the neighbors played loud music. They weren't a country, represented no one, and yet became the reason two empires clashed, simply because their location was unlucky. Soon enough, Syracuse, the wealthiest and strongest Greek power in the region, decided to clean things up. And when the Syracusan army approached, the Mamertines panicked like a rock band suddenly asked to perform classical music. So, they sent letters for help, not just one, but two. One to Carthage, the most powerful naval empire in the Mediterranean, and one to Rome, an up-and-coming power that had never fought a naval battle. Picture this like a kid getting bullied who texts both his birth mom and the stepdad who just moved in yesterday. Carthage came first. They sent a fleet, blockaded the harbour at Messana, raised their flag, set up camp, crossed their legs on wine crates, and thought, done, child's play. From Carthage's view, this was a routine cleanup. They dominated the waters around Sicily for generations, had ports, fleets, and ties with various Greek cities. To them, the Mamertines were a mosquito-level annoyance. The blockade of Messana was like a light slap, a reminder that this is our turf. But that overconfidence meant Carthage wasn't ready for the most surprising twist. An outsider, from inland, with no fleet, no maritime tradition, jumping in like someone wearing a fur coat diving into a swimming pool, just because people were clapping. And then Rome actually showed up. In the Roman Senate, during the spring of 264 BC, the debate cracked like thunder on Capitoline Hill. Some laughed, saying sending troops to an island for mercenaries was madness. But others, louder, like Appius Claudius Caudex, argued, Carthage isn't just taking Messana, they're reaching for the launch pad to our spine. Rome had no fleet, no seafaring culture, but they had something Carthage underestimated, a fear of isolation, and a stubborn instinct to never let anyone else hold the chopsticks first. Even without ships, without knowing how to swim, and unsure where Sicily even was on a map, they still sent troops. Not because they loved the Mamertines, not because they hated Carthage, simply because they were curious and vaguely anxious that, if we don't take it, someone else will. And so, in 264 BC, war broke out, not because of an assassination or a strategic resource, but because a bunch of mercenaries didn't want to lose their Airbnb. A land empire challenged a naval empire. From the point of view of Sicilians, the people living along the docks and growing grapes on hillside farms, it all felt like a divine prank. Within weeks, they saw Carthaginian ships dock, followed by Roman ones. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder, wet leather, and the sharp tang of unfamiliar weapons. An old woman in Messana reportedly said, in an unofficial account, "Every time I hear the waves crash, I don't know if it's water or blood." A small city became the excuse for the world to ignite, and Messana, like so many places trampled by history, stood there dazed, on blood-soaked cobblestones, asking the question, are we really worth killing each other over? That beginning, foolish, accidental, and driven by habits of expansion, was the first crack in the Mediterranean's orange peel. Messana, a mere dot on the map, became a symbol of how absurd ancient wars could be. Places no one truly wanted, yet were fought over to the bitter end. Just like Sarajevo nearly 2,000 years later, or Kuwait in the 20th century, Messana stands as proof that the greatest conflicts often start in places no one was really looking at, not because of value, but because of location. And from there, a whirlwind was poured into the sea. 263 BC, Rome, when people who never swam decided to conquer the sea. Nothing in Roman history before 264 BC suggested they should have a navy. No shipbuilding manuals, no proper ports, and definitely no captains. Rome was a land power, an empire with feet planted firmly on stone, not water. And no one in the Senate wanted to get involved with the sea. But then, logic lost to fear. Fierce debates erupted at the end of 264 BC. Conservative nobles opposed spending money on something no one knew how to operate. While the pro-navy faction, led by Appius Claudius Caudex, argued, if we don't learn how to fight Carthage at sea, we'll learn how to die on land. And in the end, like all major decisions in Roman history, they chose to act first and learn later. They marched to conquer. They dug roads, built camps, erected forts. The sea was just something to keep others away. And then, within a year, they built around 100 quinqueremes, the largest warships of the time, massive, with 5 banks of oars, nearly the length of a modern football field. Each ship required about 300 men to operate, half of them rowers. These ships weren't agile, weren't light, and had nothing newbie-friendly about them. They were floating fortresses, powered by sweat and shouting, every stroke a heartbeat pounding from inland. No one's sure where they learned, perhaps by copying a Carthaginian ship that had drifted near the southern coast of Italy, as Polybius later recorded. One theory says this ship, abandoned after a storm or failed raid, became the rotting wooden tutor of the Roman navy. Roman engineers and craftsmen dismantled it plank by plank, beam by beam, studying the structure as if reading sheet music they had never heard before. It wasn't school. It was strategic dissection on a floating corpse. Some accounts claim they practiced rowing on land, setting up wooden frames on the beach and placing soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, even masons who had never been to sea, inside swinging oars like they were doing rhythmic gymnastics. The soldiers wore armor, sweated, got dizzy, and vomited into wooden tubs during their first training sessions. They didn't know if they were preparing to be sailors or testing cardio endurance as some kind of religious punishment. If that image sounds funny, imagine the reaction of the Carthaginians. They, seafaring merchants since the 9th century BC, had conquered most islands from Tunisia to Spain. Their fleets were larger, faster, run by traditional maritime families. When they heard Rome, a land-based empire, had started building ships and practicing rowing on sand, they laughed like hearing someone who's never worn shoes deciding to climb Everest. The only problem was, that climb didn't stop at the first rest station. But Rome didn't plan to become sailors. They planned to turn warships into temporary ground. That's when they invented one of the strangest things in naval warfare history. Corvus, the Iron Crow, a long boarding bridge with a hooked spike mounted on the prow. In combat, Roman ships didn't need to chase. They just had to get close, drop the Corvus, hook the enemy, and Roman soldiers would leap aboard as if opening the city gates. Naval warfare was no longer a sailor's game. It became infantry warfare. Carthage never saw it coming. Rome didn't need to win at sea. They just needed to turn the sea into land. The Corvus was makeshift, brutal, and anything but elegant, but terrifyingly effective. It turned a rookie fleet into a swarm of iron spiders that hooked, climbed, and slashed. And it gave Rome the one thing most needed in war, the illusion that victory was possible, if you just knew where to hook. Rome didn't learn to swim. They learned to drag others into the water. They didn't aim to master naval combat. They just needed a bridge and a pivot point to turn the sea into a soft battlefield beneath infantry feet. The Corvus, with its iron hook and clumsy weight, was the symbolic weapon of that philosophy. And it would later drag down not just enemy ships, but entire Roman fleets when storms hit and those iron bridges unbalanced the vessels. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, it was a source of pride. A hook plunged into the sea, as if Rome was signing its name across the ancient waters. Rome didn't just build ships, they built belief. That land wasn't a limit, just a starting point. And from here on, history would no longer belong to those who could swim, but to those who dared to jump in without a life vest. 260 BC, Sicilian Sea, where war stepped onto water with an iron bridge. If war is a brutal ballroom, then Rome, a dancer who had never danced, stepped onto the floor with a plank and a hook. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't agile, and it certainly wasn't romantic, but it worked. Corvus, meaning crow in Latin, was a strange invention. A wooden bridge about 11 meters long and over 1 meter wide, hinged at the prow of the ship, able to rotate and drop down at a vertical angle. At its end was a sharp iron hook, crescent-shaped, designed to dig deep into the enemy deck. Once it latched on, the two ships were locked together like puzzle pieces, and the entire naval battlefield instantly became a blood-soaked infantry platform. The structure of the Corvus wasn't meant to be pretty or even safe. It was a crude mechanical trap, simple but deadly effective. It didn't dodge, didn't glide, didn't finesse. It hooked, and it hooked deep. When the Roman ships drew near, soldiers would drop the Corvus, jam it into the enemy deck, and cross over like engineers building bridges in a lightning operation. It wasn't naval combat anymore. It was a siege at sea. The first battle to use the Corvus was at Mylae in 260 BC. Rome's fleet, under Gaius Duilius, was freshly built, manned by soldiers who had never smelled salt water, now facing the seasoned Carthaginian navy. Everyone expected the Romans to be crushed in hours. But then, they closed in. The Corvus dropped. The hook slammed into the Carthaginian deck like a steel fang. Carthaginian sailors, used to speed and maneuver, panicked. They couldn't turn, couldn't steer, because every twist meant another hook biting into their flank. Many were flung from their decks like beans in a boiling pot. Roman soldiers, who didn't know how to row but knew how to stab, seized the moment. They stormed aboard like they were retaking a city wall, faces crusted with salt, hands soaked in blood, and feet unsure if they were standing on deck or floor. The clash, expected to be brief, lasted long enough for Carthage to realize they no longer controlled the battlefield. The result: Rome captured over 30 Carthaginian ships. Gaius Duilius, a man no one expected much from, became a hero. After the victory, he returned as the man who broke the curse of the landbound. To honor him, the Romans erected the Columna Rostrata in the Roman Forum, a triumphal column decorated with the ramming beaks of captured Carthaginian ships as if spoils from the sea were nailed into stone. They built a victory monument in the shape of a hooked enemy ship. It was the first time in Mediterranean history that a rookie fleet defeated a naval superpower, not through skillful seamanship, but with a well-timed hook. From a military perspective, the Corvus was terrifying. It didn't just break naval tactics, it broke morale. Carthaginian sailors, trained to avoid collisions, were now forced into bare-knuckle brawls between broken wood and spurting blood. Some accounts say the Carthaginian commander at the time, Hannibal Gisco, ordered a retreat, but no ship could escape. Before they could turn, 50 Roman soldiers were already leaping aboard, planting shields, and screaming like they were storming the hills of Gaul. From a poetic view, the Corvus was a sorrowful bridge. It symbolized Rome's war philosophy, not to adapt, but to conquer, to never retreat, even when the ground was gone. Romans didn't learn to row, they learned to hook. They didn't learn to dodge, they learned to grip. And when they couldn't bring the land to the sea, they folded the sea toward their strategy, like a map bent to fit their needs. The Corvus wasn't a bridge between shores, but a bridge between two world views, those who knew how to swim and those who refused to drown. But the Corvus came with a price. The bridge was too heavy. It destabilized the ship, especially in rough seas. In later battles, the Corvus caused hundreds of Roman soldiers to drown when ships capsized and the hook couldn't be pulled free in time. One account tells of a massive storm years later in which dozens of Roman ships sank, not from enemy action, but because their Corvus was still hooked to friendly vessels, dragging the fleet down like an iron chain into the deep. They say the tool that brought the first glory also delivered the first lesson in arrogance. But Rome didn't care. At the time, the Corvus was a symbol, a belief that anyone can win if they can drag others back onto their own turf. Corvus, in the end, wasn't just a bridge. It was a declaration made of wood and iron. It expressed what Rome always believed, that you don't have to become what you don't understand. You just have to turn others into failed versions of themselves. And in the Sicilian Sea, in 260 BC, the hook slammed into Carthaginian wood like the first bold statement, "We've boarded, and you are no longer safe." 260 BC, off the coast of Mylae, where history paused, rubbed its eyes and chuckled. Rome, winning, at sea. If you were a Carthaginian sailor that morning, you likely stepped onto the deck with confidence. Waves rolled steadily. The sky was clear. Your opponent, a bunch of land chickens who had just learned how to row yesterday. Some Roman ships still reeked of fresh timber. The order came, direct assault. Tear those recruits apart like Sicilian almond cake. But then, within moments, the stage flipped. The Roman fleet didn't line up in neat horizontal rows like Carthage was used to. Instead, they arranged their ships in a jagged formation, each prow jutting forward like the tip of a spear, waiting for the enemy to charge head first. It wasn't an attack formation. It was a giant wooden trap floating on the sea. Carthaginian ships moved in to sweep broadside, only to be hooked like fish on a lure. Corvus dropped, not one, but dozens. Almost simultaneously, Roman ships unleashed their hooks as if the sea were a rug being nailed in place. In that instant, no one had time to steer. No one had time to curse. Only the sound of cracking wood, screeching iron, and screaming soldiers leaping from one ship to another as if they were walking across a river. Gaius Duilius, a commander who had never led a naval battle, stood on the deck of his flagship, not commanding by strategy, but by sheer will. He didn't come from a naval family. Before this, he was a politician, known more for blunt speeches than tactical brilliance. After the victory at Mylae, he became a hero. But perhaps because of that, he was never given command again. Maybe he won too quickly and made too many others look bad. He didn't lead with complex maneuvers. He just pointed at enemy ships and yelled, "Hook them." Hundreds of oars paused, only to be replaced with swords, spears, and heavy armor. Romans didn't row well, but they stabbed with expertise. While Carthaginian soldiers were still slipping on blood-slick decks, Roman troops had already planted their shields like walls. For every Carthaginian ship hooked, a floating fortress rose from the waves. The victory at Mylae wasn't just a tactical win. It was a declaration that amateurs, if they understand their weaknesses, can rewrite the rules. Rome didn't race at sea speed. They dragged their opponents into hand-to-hand grappling, and they won, nearly completely. On the other side, Carthage withdrew toward western Sicily. They didn't understand what had just happened. Some ships turned in panic, not from orders, but from sheer survival instinct. The once invincible fleet of the West now huddled like a school of tuna caught in a net. For the first time, they didn't control the sea, not because they lacked skill, but because they had never imagined the enemy would drag the entire fight onto wooden decks. The Romans celebrated on board. They didn't know how to anchor properly, but they knew how to prop up shields as tables, use spears as fish skewers, and armor as makeshift wooden stools. Some soldiers flipped planks into tables and beat them with axe handles like a village fair. It wasn't a royal feast, but it was the first time they called the sea an ally, not an enemy. They didn't know how to anchor properly, but they knew how to turn shields into banquet tables. Historians recorded that upon his return, Duilius didn't walk the streets. He was escorted with torches and flutes, and every step he took was met with retellings of the Mylae battle like an epic poem. When chickens learn to fly, it might be because the wind's in their favor, or because they know how to hook deep into the eagle's leg, or maybe because they held on tight to those who could swim. And Rome, now no longer just a land empire, had driven a talon into the belly of the Mediterranean. A wooden hook, a victory of iron, a first nightmare for Carthage, because for the first time, the ones who couldn't swim ruled the waves. If the victory at Mylae was a direct hook to Carthage's heart, then what followed was Rome slipping on its own iron beak. After Mylae, Rome swaggered like a rookie soldier drunk on strong wine. The young navy got cocky far too fast. They built hundreds more quinqueremes, attaching corvus to nearly every one as if it were a lucky charm. They believed that as long as there was a hook, there would be victory. Engineers warned about the weight. Captains complained about the tilt, but they were ignored, because Rome, at that moment, wasn't listening to reason. They were replaying the cheers from Mylae. But the sea, unlike land, has moods, and in 255 BC, it got angry. The Roman fleet, over 300 warships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, was heading home from a campaign on the African coast. The skies were dark, the winds rose, and as the fleet reached Cape Perquinus, southeastern Sicily, a massive storm crashed down like a slap from Neptune himself. Corvus, once a divine weapon, now became a death anchor. The iron hooks attached to the ship prows, once used to leap onto enemy decks, now made the Roman ships unable to turn in time, unable to stay balanced. When the wind struck, the Corvus tipped ships heavily to one side. When the waves hit, the hooks chained ships together like iron shackles, dragging each other down. No time to float, no time to survive. More than 100 ships sank. Nearly 30,000 men died. Rome wasn't defeated, it was drowned by its own faith in its tool. Like the Titanic of antiquity, sinking not from arrows or enemy fleets, but from carrying pride forged in wood and iron nails. They didn't lose a battle. They lost to themselves, to something called not knowing when to stop. It wasn't a battle. No trumpet calls, no armor clashing. Only the sound of breaking wood, screaming men, and Roman flags drifting like paper corpses on the sea's chest. The Romans called the event a catastrophe without precedent. Corvus, once a symbol of triumph, became the scapegoat. The hooks were removed quietly, without fanfare, as if Rome wanted to forget they were ever called the pride on hinges. They didn't blame anyone. They just took them off and started learning to swim. And Carthage, though they struck not a single blow, managed a thin smile. They didn't need revenge. The sea had done it for them. Rome, for the first time, had to look inward, among broken ships, snapped hooks, and a sea that was cruelly calm. And then, like any empire that knows it's not done yet, they built more ships, not because they forgot, but because this time they knew. To master the sea, you first have to learn how it works. The price of a hasty victory sometimes is a tide that answers to no one. 255 BC, Rome decided to bring the war straight to Carthage's doorstep. A bold decision. And like every bold decision in Roman history, it started with a fleet and ended in confusion. General Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman noble with a long name and an even longer ego, was put in charge of the fleet crossing the sea to Africa. He was described as the embodiment of Roman pride, hard as steel, never retreating a step, and convinced that glory could be measured by how many steps you took into enemy territory. The goal: attack Carthage's homeland directly, force an early surrender, and maybe even write the final chapter of the war in just a few lines. At first, it all seemed reasonable. Rome landed successfully near Carthage, burned down some supply depots, took over a few towns, and spread rumors that the war was almost over. But history, like the sea, does not flow in one direction. Regulus, drunk on victory, decided to push deeper inland, despite having fewer troops and limited reinforcements. He refused to negotiate. He demanded Carthage surrender unconditionally, as if he were the main character in an epic. Carthage, backed into a corner, eventually hired Greek mercenaries, including the famed commander Xanthippus, a Spartan. And so, Regulus, with his Roman troops exhausted and unfamiliar with the terrain, was crushed at the Battle of Tunis. Xanthippus, a Spartan with a mind as disciplined as bronze armor, deployed a Greek-style phalanx on the open plain, using cavalry on both flanks to clamp down on the Roman formation like a pair of tongs made of wind and spears. Roman soldiers, used to Italy's bumpy terrain, were now ground down like flour falling into the millstone of North Africa. Thousands were killed, thousands captured. Regulus, once a living monument, became a prisoner. Some say he was tortured, nailed up, or rolled in a barrel full of iron spikes, if you believe the more theatrical historians. But true or not, Regulus became a symbol of loyalty, a man who didn't die from defeat, but from keeping his vow of honor even in chains. Rome, instead of bringing war to the enemy's door, lost a fleet, a general, and its belief that victory was inevitable. Worse, the rescue fleet sent to retrieve the remnants was also sunk by a storm, the second time in a single year. There was no battle, only waves. The rescue fleet, over 100 warships, never even saw the enemy before Poseidon's wind slapped them straight in the face. One survivor said, "I don't fear Carthage, I fear the sea." There was no glory, only tears, broken timber, and armor drifting toward no one. The Roman ships, carrying dreams of empire, drifted like half-formed ideas that never made it into full sentences. They were no longer an army, but a wet draft, folded halfway, tossed into the sea. One person later wrote, "Carthage didn't need to strike back. They only needed to wait, because Rome would trip on the sea itself." And in that moment, the sea was no longer the road to victory. It was a cold reflection of an empire that had learned how to float, but not yet how to row. Carthage, after Regulus's headfirst blunder, didn't waste time celebrating. They knew Rome would come back. And this time, they'd return with everything that could still float. In 256 BC, Rome launched its largest naval campaign to date. More than 330 warships, carrying around 140,000 people, a number that looked like putting an entire city onto the waves. The goal was still Africa, still an invasion. But this time, no one dared to call it a stroll. Carthage intercepted them off the coast near Cape Ecnomus, south of Sicily. Here, the two powers clashed not only with ships, but with their visions of sea control. This would be the largest naval battle in ancient history, measured by total number of men and ships engaged. No body of water in classical records had ever witnessed more than 600 ships crashing into each other in a single morning. Carthage had around 350 ships, arranged in a wide flanking formation, like two bat wings closing in on the Roman fleet pushing southward. Rome, learning from their earlier near drowning, divided the fleet into three sections, with warships flanking both sides, and the transport ships protected in the middle like a heart in a rib cage. From a distance, the formation looked like a spearhead charging south, but on each wave was a solemn face, knowing this time there was no room for repeated mistakes. The Battle of Ecnomus wasn't cinematic. There were no graceful spins, only the sound of iron hooks slamming onto decks, shields banging in chaos, and bodies hitting the sea like tiles falling from a winter rooftop. Corvus, once blamed for disaster, was brought back, this time as a tactical lifeline. But now, it no longer rose proudly like a symbol. It simply clung to the prow of each ship, like a soldier who had seen too much, and waited for the right moment to hold on to life. It allowed Roman soldiers to leap aboard enemy vessels on contact, turning the fleet into a drifting battlefield where Rome played to its strength, face-to-face combat. Carthage, despite their rowing skills and speed, was stunned by a strategy that used the body as an anchor. They didn't lose because ships sank, but because Rome dragged them off the sea, forcing them to fight on wood. Victory at Ecnomus was a massive comeback, not because of how many were killed, but because Rome reminded itself it could fight waves with the memory of land. They didn't learn to row better. They just learned to pull the enemy onto their own terms. And like every young empire fresh off a big win, Rome began to think, now nothing can stop us. Sadly, the sea was still there, and Carthage wasn't gone. The failed stroll had only just begun. The sea that day stood still, calm, as if it too were watching, to see what these newly buoyant beings would do next. With water still swirling at their feet, if Rome ever thought that winning Ecnomus meant they had planted their flag on the sea, then the god Poseidon, ever so politely, lifted a finger, and struck a different beat. After the great victory, Rome decided to push deeper into Carthaginian territory. The fleet was ordered to transport tens of thousands of troops to Africa, this time not just to land, but to end the war. But the wind has no memory. The sea doesn't know what ecnomus is. It only knows how to blow and strike. As the Roman fleet returned from its African campaign, a massive storm hit off the coast of Sicily. There were no omens, no warning horns, just waves rising higher than sails, wind howling like the warped trumpet of a drowning choir. Some called it the embrace of the sea god. But this embrace had no arms, only water, and the silence that followed stretched on for centuries. More than 150 ships were sunk. Around 100,000 men were killed or lost. Rome, fresh from winning the greatest naval battle, now sank beneath its own sea. No Carthage, no swords, only iron hooks, sail ropes, and screams vanishing into the wind. Every torn sail was a snapped violin string. Every fallen shield, an offbeat drum. A broken mast cracked like a strangled brass horn. A symphony of chaos, with no conductor, and the only audience, the ocean floor. The Romans called it a tragedy without an enemy. But in truth, they had met an enemy. They just didn't know its name. It was boundless confidence, the season no one asked about, the sea that doesn't need swords to take revenge. No one could fully recount it, because most who knew were already lying at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Corvus, this time, wasn't mentioned. No one pointed fingers anymore. After 2 maritime disasters in a row, Rome began to doubt itself. A later historian wrote, "The Battle of Ecnomus did not end in victory. It ended when the sea sang the final note, and Rome fell silent." And that was the most terrifying thing. Not being defeated, but when all battles vanish with no one left alive to tell the lesson. Rome had historians, scribes, poets, but this storm left no words behind. Only waves, and a few masts washed ashore like punctuation. Misplaced. Carthage didn't have to do anything. They just sat on land, quiet as someone listening to a distant, sad piece of music, knowing the crescendo was nearing its end. They didn't win, but they didn't have to. They only had to let Rome teach itself an expensive symphony. The sea, though it has no army, still holds the power of an orchestra without a drummer. And sometimes the loudest sound of disaster is when there are no trumpets at all. If someone asked, "Was there a hero in this war?" Rome would answer with a name, Marcus Atilius Regulus. He was the one who led the first campaign into Carthage, who failed, was taken prisoner, and still became a legend. According to Roman legend, after years in captivity, Regulus was sent back to Rome by Carthage as an envoy to negotiate a prisoner exchange. But before he left, he swore an oath to return if the mission failed. An oath between 2 civilizations that didn't trust each other, aboard a ship that didn't know if it would turn back. In Rome, Regulus did not advocate for peace. On the contrary, he urged the Senate to reject any agreement with Carthage, claiming it would weaken Rome's fighting spirit. Then, true to his oath, he voluntarily returned to Carthage, knowing full well he would die. Some say Regulus was executed brutally, locked in a spiked barrel, flayed, or made a public spectacle. Others doubt the story's truth, suggesting it was Roman propaganda to boost morale. But truth is sometimes less important than the symbol. Regulus, despite his failure, was etched into Roman memory as a symbol of unyielding spirit, like a ship with a broken rudder still facing forward. No one knows which ship carried him back, and no one knows where his body drifted. Only this is known. Somewhere between Rome and Carthage, between victory and storm, there was a prisoner who kept his oath, and a ship that never returned to shore. The war seemed to end many times, but the sea, like a printing press repeating mistakes, kept pushing both Rome and Carthage toward a destination no one could clearly define. In 249 years before the Common Era, Rome lost yet another fleet at the Battle of Drepana. General Publius Claudius Pulcher, in one of the most famously arrogant decisions ever made, threw the sacred chickens overboard when they refused to eat, saying, "If they won't eat, then let them drink." The result, a crushing Roman defeat. The fleet was destroyed. Pulcher was convicted of impiety. The sea, clearly, was not in the mood for jokes. Carthage, meanwhile, began to decline financially. Taxes soared, mercenaries started demanding payment, and Rome, despite every stumble, kept building new fleets, not because they loved the sea, but because they hated losing more than they feared dying. Finally, in 241 years before the Common Era, the decisive battle took place at the Aegates Islands, off the western coast of Sicily. Rome, this time without Corvus, without daring the wind, focused only on speed and technique. A newly trained fleet, funded by voluntary loans from aristocrats. Carthage was caught off guard. Their fleet was carrying reinforcements, heavy and unprepared for combat. The result, Rome won. Not gloriously, but enough to force Carthage into peace talks. The treaty was signed in 241 years before the Common Era. Sicily became Rome's first province outside the Italian peninsula. Carthage was forced to pay a massive war indemnity, and the door to Africa, finally, opened, not through a grand battle, but through mutual exhaustion. Rome's first naval war didn't end with a triumphant anthem, but with hollow silence. Neither side was the same anymore. The sea, like a cold professor, had taught them the first lesson. If you want to rule the land, you must first survive the waves. And Rome, however often it drifted, however often it sank, never stood still. They weren't born to sail, but they rode the waves to hell and learned how to draw maps with their own blood.